Well, hello everyone, and welcome to week 2 of Everybody Always. We are so glad that you came back. Your reading this week was chapters 4 through 8, and you learned from that reading how much you would not want Bob to be in charge of your vehicle maintenance in chapter 4 with his yellow truck, all the way through to learning about the futility of collecting tickets at a now out of business pizza and game spot. But what I want us to focus on today is a story in the New Testament that I think does a really good job of kind of painting the picture of a lot of the things that Bob was talking about in your reading for this week. So we're going to start in John chapter 13 and setting the stage there. Here's what's going on. Jesus has gathered in the upper room that night with the disciples. We're picking up where Judas has already left the scene. He has gone on to begin his work of betraying Jesus that we know that he is going to do. And Jesus is there with the disciples, and he starts to give them some disappointing news. He tells them that he is going to be going away from them for a little while, and he says, where I'm going, you can't come with me. And the disciples are a little bit indignant, particularly Peter. And Peter says, Jesus, I am ready to go. I'll do whatever you ask me to do. Jesus, I am ready to die for you. And Peter really believed that he was ready to do that. He really believed he was that guy. But Jesus knows that in that space, essentially Peter is posing. And Jesus says to Peter, Peter, truly, you're not ready, because here's the truth. Tonight, before the rooster crows, you're going to deny 3 times that you even know me. And so that's what I want to focus on, this event with Peter, when Jesus tells Peter, Peter, this isn't going to go the way you think this is going to go. So Jesus is arrested. We know that happens. And then we turn our attention to John chapter 18. And we're going to start in verse 17. What's happened is Jesus has been taken into the high priest's home, and Peter is standing outside in the courtyard. Chapter 18, verse 17. The woman asked Peter, you're not one of that man's disciples, are you? No, he said, I am not. Because it was cold, the household servants and the guards had made a charcoal fire. They stood around it, warming themselves, and Peter stood with them, warming himself. And then we turn to chapter 18 at verse 25. Meanwhile, as Simon Peter was standing by the fire warming himself, they asked him again, you're not one of his disciples, are you? He denied it, saying, no, I am not. There's 2. But one of the household slaves of the high priest, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, asked, didn't I see you out there in the olive grove with Jesus? And again, Peter denied it. There's 3. And immediately a rooster crowed. Friends, Peter just hit the ground from 10,000 feet. He wanted to believe so much that he was the guy who would defend Jesus to the death. That's probably why he took a knife with him that night, because he kind of could sense that something was going on, and he wanted to prove to Jesus that he would be the guy who would defend Jesus to the death. And Peter knows, he's known Jesus. They've lived together. Peter really believes in his heart of hearts that he is the guy who will defend Jesus. And then we know that Jesus is crucified. And Peter had to be wondering, can you imagine that space that Peter was in, the shame and the guilt that he must have felt? Because as far as he knows, the last thing that Jesus remembers of Peter is Peter denying him. But that's not the end of the story. Because yes, Jesus rises from the dead, and Jesus also goes really far out of his way to catch Peter on the bounce. And we see that happen in John chapter 21. What's happening in John chapter 21 is that Jesus has risen from the dead at this point, and everyone has seen Jesus. The disciples all know this, but the disciples have gathered in this room. The disciples, honestly, they don't really know what to do yet. They know that Jesus is alive, but they don't necessarily know what that even means. And so they're gathered together, going a little bit stir crazy. And finally, Peter, who was a professional fisherman his whole life, says, you know what? I'm going fishing. And everybody jumps on board and they're like, yes, Peter, that's a great idea. We'll come too. So they go out onto the boat and they are fishing all night long and they don't catch any fish. This professional fisherman doesn't catch anything. And they get closer to the shore that morning and there's a stranger standing on the shore who says, hey, you're not having any luck. Why don't you try the other side of the boat? And so Peter follows this man's instructions. They don't know that it's Jesus yet. They put their net over on the other side of the boat, and sure enough, fish just can't wait to get in their net at this point. We read later that they collected like over 150 fish. That's when Peter realizes that the man on the shore is Jesus. And so Peter jumps out of the boat and the rest of the disciples finish the work and they head back to the shore. And when they get to the shore, Jesus has already started a charcoal fire and he's got bread and fish going on the fire for them. Now, a charcoal fire smells differently than a wood fire. And so what Jesus is doing is he is very intentionally and very specifically bringing all the disciples, and especially Peter, back to that night, back to that terrible night when that terrible thing happened, because Jesus wants that night fresh in Peter's mind. And they eat together and they get to the end of their meal, and then Peter and Jesus are kind of separated from the rest of the group. And Jesus uses that opportunity to turn to Peter and say, Peter, do you love me more than anything? And fresh in Peter's mind is how he had not been the person that he had wanted to be, the person that he had believed he was. But he says, Jesus, Lord, yes, I love you. I love you more than anything. And Jesus says, okay, feed my sheep. Jesus knows Peter better than Peter knows Peter. And Jesus knows what's in Peter's heart. Jesus knows that Peter is human. But each time Jesus asks this question of Peter, 3 times he asks it, Peter, do you love me? And 3 times Peter says, yes, Lord, you know I love you. And each time then Jesus responds again with a job. He says, take care of my sheep. He says, feed my lambs. Jesus wasn't going to give Peter a job that he knew he wasn't able to do, that he knew he wasn't ready for. And that's so surprising to us because most of us would have expected Jesus to say, you know, Peter, here's the deal. I was thinking you were the guy, but based on recent events, I'm going to have to reevaluate that and let you know. No, that's not what Jesus does. Jesus reminds Peter who Peter is. When repeatedly he asks Peter that question, do you love me? He lets Peter confess that he does love Jesus. And then he says to Peter, then take care of my sheep. Peter, you are the rock on whom I will build the church. Over and over and over again, Jesus is reminding Peter of who Peter is. And this interaction between Jesus and Peter that day on the beach, probably this interaction saved Peter's life. And the reason we know that is because Peter would have been more than content to just go back to fishing. I mean, when he had a few days of not knowing what to do, what did he do? He went fishing, which is appropriate. He was a professional fisherman. But as soon as Jesus reminded him, Peter, you're the rock. You're the rock on whom I'm going to build the church. Then all of a sudden, Peter has his marching orders, and this very imperfect man goes on to establish the church in Jerusalem, all because Jesus set apart this time, set apart this space, and reminded Peter of who Peter was. Don't ever underestimate the power of telling someone who they are. Some of you are watching this today, and no one's ever told you in a way that made sense who you are. It's easy for us to collect labels as we go through life, and it happens all the time. Maybe you're the funny one, maybe you're the shy one, maybe you're the smart one, maybe you're the sporty one, whatever it is, right? And we get these labels and they kind of, stick to us or not. I feel like sometimes when people are giving us compliments, it's harder for us to believe that those labels might actually be true. We feel like posers when we do that. But on the other hand, if somebody says something negative about us, we grab onto that and we easily make that the thing that we believe about ourselves. But in that, if no one has reminded you of this for a while, I just want to remind you of what God says about you. God unequivocally, with no exceptions, without any fine print, calls you his kid. And like you can read about in the writing that Bob did in Job chapter chapter 4, the story of the prodigal son. You can read it in there. You can read it in Luke chapter 15. God calls us his kid. And when we allow ourselves to be called by that name, when we allow ourselves to be called children of God, not only does God just approve of that, but God runs to us. He runs towards us and embraces us, lifting us up off the ground, if you want to think of it that way. And God says to you, kiddo, I am so glad that you're here. I am so glad that you're home. It's so great to see you. Let's go get out the good stuff. We're going to have a party. That's how God sees you. And if no one has ever taught you that, or if it's been a while since you've heard that, you don't have to take my word for it. It's in Luke chapter 15. It's in John chapter 10 when Jesus says that he is the one who has come to take care of the sheep. The same sheep that he later hands over to the imperfect Peter, that's who Jesus is talking about when he says it's the thief that comes to steal and destroy. But Jesus says, I have come to give abundant and satisfying life. That's what Jesus wants for you. That's what he calls you to. He calls you to a rich and satisfying life. And it's not just words. You know that it's true because Jesus actually went to the cross for you. Jesus went to the cross for you. You are someone for whom Christ died, and he does not regret that decision, not for 1 second. It's not like God is looking around and he's got a set of people over here who he's really proud of, and he's got a set of people over here who he merely tolerates. That doesn't exist. God loves you. And you know that he did because he sent his only son to go to the cross to make a way for you to be with him forever. So as I prepare to close today, I want to leave you with a couple of things. The first is from Ephesians Chapter 3, verses 17 through 19. Then Christ will make his home in your heart as you trust in him. Your roots will grow down into God's love and keep you strong. And may you have the power to understand, as all God's people should, how wide, how long, how high, and how deep his love is. May you experience the love of Christ, though it is too great to understand fully. Then you will be made complete with all the fullness of life and power that comes from God. And the last thing is from Bob. Page 75, the last words that you read this week. God's love and his grace are for you. He is on your side. He calls you his kid. And Bob says this, the promise of love and grace in our lives is this: our worst day isn't bad enough, and our best day isn't good enough. We're invited because we're loved, not because we earned it. You're God's kid, not because you've earned it, but simply because you are loved, because that's who God is. That's what we've got for you for this session, and thanks for joining us, and we'll see you again soon.